Okay, actually, so before I even move forward here, let's take a look at this chronology here just for a second. Right, so 1939, German-Soviet conquest of Poland. Remember, so Poland, the Soviets and the Nazis, who are inherently enemies, make this pact and they divide up. Poland gets to be caught in the middle of these two big guys, and one half goes into Soviet influence sphere, and the other half to the Nazis at the expense of the Polish. Okay, and then we see 1940 German Blitzkrieg in Denmark. Norway begins. So we have a lot of we have a lot of places we're not going to be able to cover in detail. Germans attacking Western Europe by 41, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. Congress starts at least helping out the British and then later the Soviets by giving aid, not being involved. Okay, and so you're going to see by April, German invasion of the Soviet Union postponed, German offensive in Yugoslavia, okay, in Greece and North Africa. Okay, here again, just remind us of this being a world war, right? Okay, so now returning to that, so we saw with Europe, right? Just right there, I was just kind of going over. Almost everyone was affected in some way by what was happening, and essentially, one second here. Oops. Actually, let me go back. Oops. Okay. So, we have the situation with even North Africa being heavily involved. But actually, let me just return back. Sorry. This is one of those moments where, when you're a professor and you're taking a look at this big picture here, I kind of go through saying, okay, which parts do I really want to emphasize first? First of all, let's talk about the U.S. role. So we talked a little bit just a second ago about the Lend-Lease Act, passed in March 1941. And this gave Britain access to U.S. industrial products during World War II. Okay? And that means, and their payment would be postponed for the duration of the war. So basically, we were giving them free weapons in the meantime. Something that's not talked about in here is that just like with World War I, many Americans were really, really reluctant to get involved in another European war. And we kind of forget about this, or we don't think about this, that many American immigrants were immigrants from European countries, right? My family background, Swedish, German, Scottish, these people left that place. And I think that you could say that a lot of, especially old-timers, but even some younger, are saying, gosh, we left that area to get away from European drama. We wanted a new country to go to do something different. And we don't want to be a part of these issues that are going on there. On the other hand, excuse me, you also had Americans that were sympathetic towards various sides. You did have German American communities sympathetic for the Nazis. You did have Italian Americans sympathetic towards the fascists. You had a lot of things like this. And also what we're not talking about is eventually what's going to happen is that even though, you had all these German Americans, let's say Eisenhower, what's his last name? What does that sound like? Huh? Eisenhower? Perfect German. All right? His patriotism wasn't called into question, but Japanese Americans are going to get thrown into American concentration camps. Or they're called internment camps, but we can call them concentration camps. American citizens that had no crime other than being Japanese, being the wrong ethnicity, even though they didn't do that to Germans or Italians or anybody else in America. Just think about that. Okay, but Okay, so America though was able to at least give support, and Roosevelt, I mean Churchill was pleading for help, and Roosevelt really did apparently want to get America to get into the war to help out the British, but um, it wasn't something politically feasible. So we could really argue that while it's true that the American leadership doesn't always listen to the public, at the same time, I think you could argue that in World War I and World War II, that the American public really had a pretty overwhelming sense of not wanting to do this, and this was going to be a very difficult political move for politicians, okay, at the time. So just explaining that reluctance by Americans. And so then you had, eventually, though, of course, we know that Japan was also expanding, and Japan was fascist as well. And they bought into a lot of the ideas of fascism, and they were doing very successfully in their military campaigns and very brutal, and taking over parts such as territories that the Dutch used to have, Hong Kong, the Philippines, and actually, I just want to say something about Japanese brutality. And as we're seeing in this war, nobody really is clear of doing something atrocious. But they had what they would call comfort women. One of the controversial aspects of what Japan would do is, I had a third world feminism class, and there was a Filipino woman. She wrote a book on being a comfort woman in the Philippines for Japanese soldiers. And what they would do is, the Japanese military didn't like the idea of the shame. I mean, we read about what they did in China, where they were, gang raping Chinese women and using babies, tossing them in the air on bayonets and all this really terrible things. They wanted to confine, the Japanese government, Japanese men to not rape publicly, but they wanted to kind of control their sexual impulses. So they'd send men to find collaborators within Korea and Philippines and other places that they were at, find young virgin girls, sometimes very young, and then they would take them, and then they would just rape them all day long. Literally tie a girl down if need be, or leave her in this tent, and an entire line of soldiers, who some just got back from fighting a war, and they just go one after the other, like all day long for days. I mean, I'm sorry to be so graphic to tell you, but this is something that's a very tragic aspect. And it's one of the reasons why in China and Korea and the Philippines that Japan has left such a bitter taste in the mouths of people from this war. I actually had a student of mine who, when I brought this up, a high school student, I was in a high school setting, she said, "Mr. Pollock, I used to have Japanese comics in my house, like, that all kids like, the mangas or whatever." And she said, "My grandma saw it and she screamed and threw it out. And she said, 'Don't let ever anything Japanese happen in this house again.'" She said, "Mr. Pollock, my grandma was one of those women, those comfort women that were abused in that setting. And that's she couldn't handle anything Japanese." This is one of those tragedies of the war, and it's one of those tragedies that a lot of people here in the States don't know about. It's a really touchy subject in Japan, and it's a really outspoken topic in places like Korea and Philippines. Okay, so I'm just pointing that out. And in any case, as the Japanese were asserting themselves in that area, I believe one of the things that's also not talked about, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but we were cutting off some supplies to the Japanese as well. It wasn't completely like the attack wasn't so random, okay? And America, in a sense, wanted to. There's also controversy. It's not talked about in this book, but I've had other textbooks that address it. It's not clear, but some think that perhaps Pearl Harbor, that our government let it happen. so that Americans would finally like kind of support us going into the war. It's a controversial theory. It's based on some fact, but it's not substantial enough to really solidify and say this is 100%. And so I just kind of want to point that out one way. But there is that idea there. And I've read many Americans that say that they think that if he did do that, fine. I mean, Americans needed to get into the war. A lot of people feel like, and we're taking too long to do it. And the Japanese attack gave that impetus because after that, Americans were like, okay, yeah, now we're going, right? Okay. And this really impressed Hitler as well. There's a debate about what the Japanese were really thinking that the U.S. was going to do in response to this. And keep in mind, you might think, what is this racist Hitler? He hates the Slavs, he hates the Jews, he hates the Gypsies, the Roma people. He's working with Asians? Well, in racial theories in the West, not just with the Nazis, there was a belief that actually Japanese, if you see the Japanese, are lighter skinned. Japanese were being fed also this information to themselves by the West, that in the Asiatic world, Japanese are actually superior, close to like white people. And the Chinese and, oh my God, the Philippines and Vietnamese are like a whole another several degrees lower. And so there was this hierarchy of race. And the Japanese were close enough to be considered white brothers, believe it or not, in this. And so this is something that's kind of tragically interesting about this whole racial concept thing going on at the time. But as I pointed out, in America at this point, for Japanese Americans, they're going to face the worst times of their life here in the United States for doing nothing, while German Americans and Italian Americans and others on the side of the Axis are not going to go into concentration camps like they're going to put Japanese Americans here into these internment camps. Okay, so I just want to point that out. Now, what about these turning points in the tide of the war? Okay, I'm going to stop here and I'm actually going to return to that in the next lecture.